this picture is still one of my favorites because it shows the two parties in this war, and it also shows very succinctly how the war is going. You might remember all the experts you saw on TV pretty much 1 year ago, with all their statements, oh, it will be over in 3 days, Ukraine is finished, they have no chance, why don't they give up? And you see that things have developed quite differently. And in order to understand what that means for Ukraine after the war, it's important that you understand where all of this is coming from, especially if you've never really heard about the country or never really studied its history. And when you see one of the tales that Russian propaganda, particularly here in the West, is trying to convey is that well, Ukraine actually never existed. It was basically always part of Russia, and Russia is, so to speak, the natural or the historic heir of the Kievan Rus. And well, if you take a real fact-based look at Ukraine, then it's rather the other way around. You would say that definitely Ukraine was there first. So when Volodymyr the Great ruled from Kiev, Moscow didn't even exist. And when Yaroslav ruled there, Moscow didn't exist either. It didn't exist until the early 13th century. Now, many people in the West are not aware of that fact. And we have to understand that much of what we seem or believe to know about Ukraine was actually channeled into the West by Russian propaganda. So I always start with these pictures and say, well, identify Russia on this map. Russia does not exist on this map. It doesn't exist for a very, very, very long time. And what you also have to consider is the history of the Mongolian Empire, and the greatest empire that has ever existed on this earth. And believe it or not, most people have never even heard of it. Probably because, well, it's some time ago, but when I say, have you ever heard of Genghis Khan? Oh yeah, Genghis Khan, that evil man who killed so many people. But the real extension of the Mongol Empire begins long after the death of Genghis Khan, with his sons and his grandsons. And you see that this enormous empire, which stretches basically from Vietnam to Poland, decomposed into several Mongol sub-empires, if you will. And the one we are basically concerned with until this day is what you see in the very west, the empire of the Golden Horde, or the Kipchak, as they call them themselves. So again, what Russia is trying to make you believe is that it is an ancient nation that has ruled Eurasia like since ancient times. But the fact is that if you look at a map of Europe, and this would be in the early to mid 15th century, then you would see that the princedom of Moscovia, so in other words, this is a subject to the Khans of the Golden Horde, and in fact doesn't exist as a sovereign state until 1480. And you could say that Ivan IV is the first who really expands the Russian Empire. He's the one who conquers Kazan and deposes the Khan. So, and that gives you an idea of what Russia has been ever since. So, in a way, Russia does a reverse colonization of the Mongol Empire. So the Russia we know today is a product of imperial expansion that first goes into these enormous stretches of Siberia, and all the local peoples that live there are thrown under the yoke of the Tsars. And then we have several other waves of expansion. For example, the Peter I expansion to the Baltic Sea. And then Catherine, of course, with her conquests to the Black Sea coasts and the wars against the Ottoman empires. And then starting with Alexander the second, the expansion into Central Asia and what is today Kazakhstan. And the final episode with Nicholas I, and who bites a bit from ancient China, the imperial China, which is, so what we know today as Vladivostok and Khabarovsk was imperial China until 1860. And now you have to know this imperial drive that has characterized Russia for a long time if you want to understand why is it attacking Ukraine, or what's the idea behind attacking Ukraine. It's really this. It's basically denying the idea that sovereign nations that once were in the Russian sphere of influence, or even part of the Soviet Union, forced into the Soviet Union in Ukraine's case, that this cannot be undone, that the empire must rule in some way. So even if it's a state that is allowed to exist on its own, that state is influenced or is somehow bound to the empire. And this imperial idea is present in the Soviet Union as well as in modern Russia. So it's a very dominant motive. I would just show you what this means for contemporary Russia. It means that we have an empire that consists of, well, very, very different elements and peoples that were subjected during this imperial expansion. And of course, you see what the idea is. If you don't want to belong to this empire, then you are, well, forced into it. And it gives you an idea of what is happening with contemporary Ukraine. When you look at how this empire looks like in terms of, well, the realities of life, in terms of well, wealth of the population, in terms of GDP by region. I don't know if you've ever traveled in Russia outside of Leningrad, St. Petersburg and Moscow. The first thing you know is the absence of infrastructure and the extreme poverty. Extreme poverty. And of course, that is also something that Russian propaganda does not like you to know. They show you all these glossy images about historic St. Petersburg and historic Moscow, yeah, and all of that is true, but it doesn't show you the whole idea of the country. And you see, this is basically the opposite of what you would do as a developed country in terms of economic development. The idea is not to make poor people rich. The idea is to expand the empire for the empire's sake. So to get territory or to get power, to get influence, if that means the great flag of the empire is well, flowing over ruins, well, then let there be ruins, but it will be the ruins of the empire. And that's something you see in this war from the first day, this systematic destruction of infrastructure, of houses, of tenements, of dwellings, irrespective of whether or not it conforms to the Hague Convention or to the rules of war. The idea is simply imperial expansion. The idea is not to care for any of these people who have to live there, but the idea is some abstract greatness. And that, of course, gives some people the idea that, well, if you have lived under this Russian central rule for a long time and you have resources of your own, then you might get, well, you might get an idea that you could just as well be independent. What do you get from Russian central rule? You see, this also is a motive that you have in Russian history. This motive of people who say, well, we do not longer want to be ruled, so we break away. And of course, once that happens, then Moscow has to intervene in some way or the other to prevent the collapse of the empire. So some of the candidates who would be economically able to do that would be the republics of the Middle Volga, and in particular Bashkortostan and Tatarstan. Tatarstan, for example, is the origin of the Druzhba oil pipeline, which channeled oil to Europe before the oil embargo, and also to Kazakhstan. And you see that this has happened before. And this, I would say, is the psychological state in which all Russian leaders live in particular, this applies to Putin's thinking. This disintegration of the empire, this breaking away of regions that were once subjected by Russia, this has happened before in history. So this is what happened during the Russian Civil War, immediately after the end of the First World War. People thought, well, now is the time to choose our own path in history. And now when you conform to a rule of law and say, well, a sovereign nation or a people who decides we want to live in our own state and we want to live according to our own life, in way of life in our own state, then you are simply free to do it. Now, what do you do if you're the Russian Empire? You simply won't allow it. And if that happens, you will intervene by force. And I think that is the motive that explains all sorts of Russian intervention into Ukrainian policy, and especially the violent interventions. And you can go back to the gas wars with Ukraine in 2006 and 2009. You don't even have to go back to the Maidan. You can start with the Orange Revolution. But this motive of, well, you belong to my empire. And if you want to break away, then I won't let you. And if you, well, cite the rule of law, then I will use violence to keep you in my empire. And this motive, I think, explains a lot of what is behind the war. And it also explains the recklessness and the extreme violence against the civilian population with which this war is fought. So this is not a war that confronts, that conforms to the rules of the Hague Agreement. This is a war that demands you subject yourself to the empire. And if you don't do that voluntarily, then we will raze everything you have to the ground. We will kill your civilians. We will raze your buildings. We will kill your dams, your electricity, whatever, until you conform and subject yourself to the empire. So you see the idea. This is not our, I would say, clean or legal way of conducting war. This is something completely different. This is something before the modern world. It's a very ancient motive, a very violent motive that is characterized by complete lawlessness. And you have to understand this imperial motive in order to understand why the war is fought this way and why it's fought with this extreme brutality and why civilian infrastructure is targeted so much. And this is why I always start with Russia before I actually come to explaining Ukraine. And no Russian leader has greater fear than for these pictures. And this is what happened after the failed invasion in Afghanistan in 1989 and the following dissolution of the Soviet Union. So these are pictures from the Baltic states, from Latvia and from Lithuania on the right. This is Dushanbe in Tajikistan, the beginning civil war. And this is from the Caucasus. And you see this man in his national ethnic dress holding up a picture of Gorbachev. So you see this motive of you have to stay in my empire, and if you try to break away, I will use violence to keep you in the empire. This motive did not work after the failed invasion in Afghanistan because the Red Army was simply not capable of controlling all of these movements. And you may remember that Gorbachev, who is a very loved and famous person in Western Europe, Gorbachev was actually the one who sent tanks into the Baltic states in order to keep them in the empire violently. If you go to Germany and you say, oh, Gorbachev, yeah, he was the one who gave us German unity. Yeah, great guy. The fact that he tried to subject the Baltic states is less known. But still, you see that this imperial motive is irrespective of ideologies. It's irrespective of the particular leader. It's something that is very, very deep in the idea of what the Russian state is. And this particular государство, this particular word, what the Russians use, is there is no real Western translation for it. So it's not just sovereignty. It's something bigger. It's something like the state is above everything. It's in particular above the individual, and it's also above the law. And if you're above the law, then you're just free to do anything and to use all violence you deem necessary to uphold your empire. And of course, that means well, that means probably greater problems ahead for Russia, because the war is definitely not going as planned. But I don't want to talk so much about Russia today, but just to give you an idea of what it means if the war is not going as it was planned. Russia is being demilitarized at this time against its will. And this is the conservative Oryx list. And it's outdated, by the way. We have a jubilee. It's by now it's more than 2,000 tanks that have been annihilated. That would be about 2/3 of the conventional Russian tank fleet. And the picture is similar for other heavy systems. So I would say that there is a good reason to believe that Ukraine will not be defeated in military terms. And the more that Western military support is coming into Ukraine, and you see that many nations have completely changed their narratives and also their views on Ukraine. Think France, for example, or the most extreme example, think Germany. Germany started out from a discussion like, oh, there is a war in Ukraine. Oh, do we have to care about these people in the East? Oh, well, yeah, let's send them 5,000 helmets. But just for show. I mean, it will be over in 3 days. Now, look at Germany today. Should we send them fighter planes? Yeah, well, maybe later. But first, let's give them a batch of 100 tanks. And this happened within 12 months. So there is an extreme change of sentiment and opinion in Western Europe, particularly due to the fact that many people have learned a lot about these areas or these states that they, well, barely knew they existed. I mean, honestly, those of you who are not Russian or Ukrainian, had you ever traveled to Ukraine or Russia? Did you actually know about their history? Did you know these states existed? See, probably this audience does, because you are somewhat naturally interested in the topic. But speaking to all the viewers who now see us on Zoom, it's also an information point of view. And this is why I always keep saying Russian propaganda was exceptionally skillful and successful with giving us images about Russia and giving us images about Ukraine that shaped the way we were thinking about the East. And the good thing about the war, as terrible as it is, but the war no longer lets you do that. The war creates information and the war creates facts that you cannot hide from the world. You can, of course, ignore the facts, yes, but you cannot hide them. And that, of course, puts Ukraine now on the landscape. And I just couldn't resist and bring you some of my favorite, some of my favorite memes. And I'll just let Anastasia do some maintenance here. Okay. Well, it doesn't matter. We can just leave it like this, right? Okay. Thanks very much. Well, I was about to say that Ukraine is fast and innovative. I'm coming to that point. But when we just take some now the enter should work. Yeah, I was here exactly, and I wanted to present you some of my favorite memes. And I personally am very much guilty of this. I had written about Russia and about Russian armaments and weapons system as early as 2014, when they boasted about the Armata T-14, their terrible new wonder weapon tank, which we haven't seen until this day on the battlefield, just on parades. But I'm guilty of that on the lower left corner. And I had been saying, well, Russian military, ooh, these people are mean and dangerous. So yes, they don't care about the rule of law. And yes, they are a terrible empire, but they have terrible military power. Now, it seems that the war is showing us a completely different picture right now. One of my favorites is also the knight from Monty Python's Night of the Coconuts. Russia hasn't even started yet. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, come on, Volodya, show us what you're capable of. I haven't seen a thing until these days. This is something the world has to wake up to. We still live with these images in the head, in our heads, particularly in the German-speaking countries, not only in Germany, that Russia is a terrible power that cannot be defeated. And I have been saying this is wrong. Russia can and will be defeated. And that means Ukraine will exist as a sovereign nation. Of course, it will suffer heavy casualties and will be destroyed to some extent in the war. That is true, but it can be rebuilt. So I don't think that we have to consider a scenario where Ukraine ceases to exist as a sovereign state, or where basically Putin has some sort of success by just taking out or biting away a part of Ukraine, say, for example, the Donbass or whatever, like Nicholas the First did with this chunk of Imperial China. I don't think that is a scenario. And if you're talking to Germans, or if you're German yourself, then you might know this thought: nuclear powers cannot be defeated. Oh, yes, they can. And they have been defeated in conventional terms. You may remember Green Man, the United States defeat and withdrawal from Afghanistan. You may remember Saigon in '73. You may remember the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan. So yes, of course, nuclear powers can be defeated in conventional wars. And we will see another example where a nuclear power is defeated. So don't make the mistake and get into this nuclear fear narrative. So while we would say that, well, in terms of Russia, we would have to deal with probably a scenario of Russian disintegration or of internal Russian violent conflicts. The focus turns to Ukraine because we don't have to focus so much about these speculative criteria, but what we have to focus on is if Ukraine prevails in the war and is preserved as a sovereign nation, how will Ukraine look like after the war? And what does that mean for civil reconstruction of Ukraine, and of course for future military security? And see, in historical hindsight, of course, one of the problems is that Ukraine was in the 1990s under the impression that the Budapest Memorandum would actually live up to the paper it's written on. So you would say that, okay, we abandon our nuclear weapons, we demilitarize to some extent, and we get so-called security guarantees. And you see what these security guarantees are worth right now. So we have to deal with a different mindset for Ukraine after the war, just as we have to deal with this mindset for Russia after the war. So for Russia, we don't have so much rosy outlooks, but I don't want to focus on Russia so much. This is what I normally say about Russia, but but this is not a lecture about Russia. So this is just what I wanted to tell you to give you some background to understand the future of Ukraine. And you may remember one of the first images we got from the war were Ukrainian farmers who were sitting on their big John Deere machines, which were bigger than the Russian tanks, and towing them away. This reminded me of a quote from a German philosopher and poet, Johann Gottfried Herder, who actually traveled to Ukraine in the 18th century, so when it still was the country of the Cossacks. And he said this following, and I'll just try to give you a rough translation if you're not a German speaker. Ukraine will be a new Greece. The nice sky of these people, their humorous being, their musical nature, their fertile land, and so on, all of them will wake up, and from so many wild, small peoples like the Greeks used to be, a moral nation will emerge, and her borders will stretch to the Black Sea and from there into the world. Now, he wrote that at a time when we didn't have a modern day understanding of what a nation state is. So Ukraine was ruled by Cossacks, some of whom were subject to the Tsar. But you see that one of the ideas that the war has given us is that there now is a much stronger sense of unity, or a much stronger idea of what it means to be a Ukrainian citizen. So what we still have in the West is this Russian propaganda tale of like, oh, there are the people in Donbass are actually Russians, or well, oh, Russian language is forbidden in Ukraine. Oh, these terrible Nazis. And you see, it's quite the opposite. I mean, the Ukrainians among you, I don't know which family you come from, but you probably use Russian in your family, or you use both, depending on whether your parents are Ukrainian or Russian or both. So you're used to using both languages. And before the war, this was actually not so much a topic, but it became a topic in the war, and it will, of course, become a topic after the war. So if there was any doubt before the war that there is something like Ukrainian citizenship, or that there is something like a Ukrainian state, then I would say that doubt no longer exists. But it will be, of course, a state that will be multilingual, that will be multi-religious. So it will be a pluralistic state, but that doesn't mean that it has several identities in terms of nationality. That I believe that this is probably the one and probably the last war that Ukraine fights for its sovereignty and for its national borders. And so this is one of the reasons why so much like this meme, see a nation where everyone said, okay, this nation is strange, right? It's got no unified language, it's got no unified religion, and there are the Greeks who live in Mariupol, and these people are Orthodox, and then there are other Orthodox people, and then there are the Jews, and all sorts of other people, and this strange mixture. This cannot be a country, right? And we are faced with the Ukraine after the war, where these narratives, I think, will no longer play any role. And Ukraine will also be recognized in the West as a sovereign state, where we no longer have these Russian propaganda tales of like, okay, but it's not a real state, right? Because the East is different. Or, well, it's not a real state because some are Jews and some are Orthodox. We will no longer have these discussions. And as terrible as the war is, I think that we will get a different Ukraine. So the Ukraine after the war will no longer be the Ukraine of the Budapest Memorandum. This is certainly not a nation that will ever again rely on so-called security guarantees or on so-called great powers that give Ukraine assurance. Because who would these great powers be? I mean, one of the signatories of the Budapest Memorandum was, right, the United States, and another was Russia. So United States, okay, learned the lesson fast. Germany, France took a lot longer. But in fact, if you were Ukraine right now, would you ever again consider making treaties that Russia signs, but that does not respect? And treaties that the Western signatories, well, may respect, but may come much too late if you're attacked ever again. So that means for you as Ukraine, you will, of course, be a nation that, well, that looks like this. Heavily armed to the teeth, and I would say for the meantime with Western technology, because the ex-Soviet technology that still exists or existed in Ukraine is of course being attrited by the war and is being destroyed, and it is gradually replaced by Western systems. But you see that while these Western systems, of course, they give you capability for the war right now to conduct the war, it doesn't mean that Ukraine will stay at this Western level, but this is actually one of the directions I think where it will develop in this direction. So Ukraine, to the surprise of many Westerners, has learned extremely fast to use Western weapons systems. And you may remember that pretty much 1 year ago, we had very arrogant dialogues in the West. Like Ukrainians cannot use Western weapon system in so short a time. They would have to, well, to learn them, and oh, can these people actually read Latin characters because they use this strange Cyrillic thing? This is the type of discussion we are coming from, and we had such discussions in May 22. Oh, should we give Ukraine artillery? Because artillery, oh, that's terribly complicated and also very, very dangerous. Can these people actually operate it? Now, today, we are talking about giving Ukraine F-16s, and that is no longer a question of if, it's just a question of when and how many. So if you ask Ukraine today, which weapon systems do you need, how many, and by when, the only answer you get is yes, and more of them. But that gives you a false picture, because it makes you believe that Ukraine actually has no technical capability and is dependent on the West. And that is not really true, because not only due to this MacGyver style of technological innovation and adaptation. Think about the Harms 88 missile, for example. No one thought that you could actually attach a Western missile to a Soviet airframe, and still it worked. So think about all the digital innovations Ukraine has brought in the battlefield. Think about the drones that Ukraine uses very, very successfully. So that gives you an idea of what Ukraine used to be. It used to be one of the finest locations for Soviet weapons manufacturing back in the days, in the 1980s. And Ukroboronprom is the heir of that era. So for all of you who are not used to this type of conglomerate, it's basically a state conglomerate of arms manufacturing and arms technology. So obrony is Russian for defense, and prom is short for promyslenie, industry. So it means Ukrainian defense industry. And back in the Soviet times, Ukraine had many famous locations, both for the production of these weapons, so in what is today called Donbass, but it also had and has to date very fine technical universities like Kharkiv, for example, where you have great renowned researchers and teaching for, say, engineering, mathematics, IT. So all of this is not lost, although, of course, many of the inhabitants of Kharkiv are now refugees, but these people are now partially in the West and partially in other regions of Ukraine. But you see that this knowledge or this capability that Ukraine has and has inherited from these days is not lost, but it will come back. And what this is one of the first things I would like to remember when you leave this lecture, is that even today, Western arms manufacturers are active in seeking cooperation or joint ventures or other sorts of agreements that go beyond the mere exporting of weapons. And Rheinmetall from Germany is one of the examples where you would say, okay, here's a CEO who sees much more potential than most politicians, and who is already engaging in this type of joint venture. So the very next generation of the Leopard technology, we all know that Leopards are now fighting in Ukraine, but these are actually not the actual state-of-the-art technologies. Leopards we have now in Ukraine are A4 and A6, but the technology you're going to produce after the war is A8, and this is what's coming to Ukraine. So precisely because Ukraine will be a very belligerent nation, and one that is, of course, protecting its border, Ukraine will be one of the regions in Europe where you will develop and use arms technology. It will be, in a way, the eastern fortress of the Western states, because the Western states have all hands full now with reorganizing their militaries. And in a way, we can be lucky that Ukraine is now waging this war, because if you think, well, what before the war, what was behind? The Polish army before the war? Okay, the Poles are right now expanding their army at breakneck speed because, well, they have been occupied by the Soviet Union. They know what it's like to live in the empire. And what's next? The German army? And they can invent nice words like Zeitenwende, turn of the times, nice word. Oh, here's 100 billion euros. Oh, nice. But the challenge lies ahead, right? What do you buy from these 100 million euros? So it's a nice step, but it will take time to build up that military. So if there is a military that will be constructed very, very fast and that has combat experience and fine technology, then it will be this. So this will be the place you have to be in this industry. And this gives you an idea of how the eastern border now looks like. These are the NATO surveillance and reconnaissance flights that are currently being performed every day, 24 hours at the border. So the idea is, of course, you see these are ADS transponders, and you can identify ADS transponders by yourself. For example, on Flight Radar 24, all sorts of amateurs can do that. It's not like classified, or it's not even difficult. You can just go on any website and see these transponders. And of course, the idea is that you are terribly visible. So what NATO is communicating to the Russians is like, hello, we are here. We see what you're doing and you can see us. So don't fuck with us. That's the idea. This is why you're so visible. And you see that, of course, Ukraine, now being the combat zone, does not have these reconnaissance flights in its very own territory. But if you imagine the world after the war, so this eastern fortress is stretching, see, like a thorn into southern Russia. And you consider that all this border between Ukraine and Russia and Ukraine and Belarus will be fortified and closed. Then you will need local NATO air and troop bases to maintain this level of surveillance. But this is the world we are moving into, and this world will look like this. It's not exactly the Cold War reloaded, because this border looks terribly fortified in physical terms, but it is still partially open. So if you're now in Russia, you can still travel to Europe, you can still enter the Schengen area, you can still travel to Turkey, you can travel to Central Asia. The Russian border is not closed. And if you're Russian and living in Europe right now, you can travel back to Russia. Well, you might be questioned at the border and then sent to Ukraine as cannon fodder. But yes, you can travel back to Russia. So it's not like exactly the Iron Curtain reloaded, but it will be, of course, a situation where we have to live with pictures like this. And you see, this is the what you see here in the vicinity of Tolce in Poland. This is what the nature in this area looks like. So this would be the Białowież area, which is basically a large natural ecological reservoir, and nature would look like this on the Belarus side, and this is the Polish side. And you can imagine how this will look like for hundreds of kilometers. And we have, of course, like geopolitical problems, like, for example, the Kaliningrad exclave, which is now being sealed off both by Poland and by Lithuania. And there is just a little train line that connects Kaliningrad with the rest of Russia. This also would be a candidate for defecting, for leaving the empire, because you can see that your normal relations and your normal trade flow would be in the Baltic Sea and with your Baltic neighbors and not back to Russia. Just mentioning this, but you can see that, well, the Poles and also the Baltic nations have been very active at constructing these things, but now consider the border between Ukraine and Russia. The border between Ukraine and Belarus is already being fortified, and the road connections you had before the war are mostly severed because they were detonated by the Ukrainian army to dissuade the Belarusian army to invade. But well, if you take a look at what's going on in the Belgorod area right now, then you will notice that you have basically 900 kilometers of flat steppe land, no forests, no large rivers, no mountains, no nothing. It's just flat land. And you have to fortify this border against Russia. So this gives you an idea of the immense construction work that is coming up in this area. And so it would probably look something like this. If you've ever been there, this is the three-state corner, which is called Three Siostry in Russian, the Three Sisters. It's actually a propaganda monument. By Three Sisters, Russia, of course, well, they put up a nice little statue there. And what is meant, of course, is that all Slavic nations are sisters, and of course, Russia is the biggest among them. Now, Three Sisters is no longer imaginable, because you see that these three borders which meet at these points will rather look like this. This is another picture from Poland, and this is a picture from the wall that now covers parts of the border between Belarus and Ukraine. So this is the world we are moving into, at least in the east, and this is how it used to look before. So this is not, the upper right is not from Tisostri, but this is how it looked like. So you had green meadows, and Ukraine just ended, and Belarus began, and this world will simply no longer exist. This is basically the world of my childhood. This is the Berlin Wall. This is the inner German border, and this is the world we are going back to. So it's somewhat sad, but on the other hand, of course, the relations and the links. No problem. Just stay alive. The borders we have to the west will, of course, be expanded in the same intensity as the borders to the east are closed. And that gives you an idea of where, for business models, where Ukraine could develop into. And before the war, I would say that if you knew anything about Ukraine at all, then you would say, oh, Ukraine, it's that large country where you have this black earth that is so fertile, which is true. And that makes many people think, and we also had this discussion pretty much 1 year ago, that Ukraine is basically an agrarian nation that has lots of sunflowers, nice, and lots of wheat, nice. But it gives you somewhat of an idea that it's a developing country, that there is nothing out there but grain or but sunflower oil. And that is simply wrong, of course, to reduce the country to this to this aspect. But of course, this agricultural business will have problems after the war, because I do not believe that there will ever be a peace treaty with Russia. The war will simply end with a Russian defeat and withdrawal, but there will be no peace treaty. And that means the Black Sea will remain a disputed or even a combat zone, which means you cannot simply export grain or oil as easily as you used to, and you will probably have to pay off Turkey, because Turkey will be one of the powers after the war that controls the Black Sea. So you see that the linkages that Ukraine had historically And the export routes that it had before the war will probably not work in the same way as they used to. And that implies that you would have to think about expanding the corridors to the west. And one idea of how you could do this is by expanding the rail link to the west. Many people have now heard about Ukrainian railways. Well, they now know that railways actually exist in Ukraine. Nice. Oh, it's a developed country. They have railways. Huh? And of course, if you're from Germany, or if you traveled in Germany, then you know that Germans love to bash Deutsche Bahn. German Railways is infamous for its terrible service. It's never punctual. Often trains don't even run. This is why all Germans go by car. And they were very surprised to learn about Ukrainian railways and their terrible punctuality. Even if they're targeted by missiles, even in a war scenario, they still run on time, which is pretty impressive. And it gives you an idea that this large country is basically being connected by railway. But due to historical reasons, we have still very little connections to the West. This is partially due to these annoying things called mountains. Unfortunately, the best thing you could have is a direct corridor from the east to the west, to the Rhine corridor. Unfortunately, we have these stupid Alps in between. So it's not so simple to do it. But what you actually could do is, well, to expand your corridor into Poland. So to go this way from Lviv, I will just show you this on the next slide, to Lviv, and from there to Przemysl, into Poland, through the German lowlands, and then into the Rhine corridor, where you could move to Geneva in the south and to Rotterdam in the north, and therefore reach the global seas without having to go through the Black Sea. And I think that is something very important for Ukraine to consider, because economic development after the war, of course, requires infrastructure. That applies to both physical infrastructure like railway, but also applies to electricity. Another thing that many people were surprised to learn is that, oh, Ukraine is not an agrarian country. There are actually people who can write code. Oh, interesting. Yeah, many people had to learn so many things about this strange East that no one knew about. But again, I've mentioned Kharkiv before, and this is particularly relevant with respect to the Ukrainian refugees who are now in Europe. In particular, in Switzerland, we have a very advantageous regulation with this S status, whereby refugees can work and get a residence permit. And you see that since many of these people are now in Germany or Poland or Switzerland, and since many of these people will go back, if you are a Western entrepreneur or a Western research organization, of course, now would be the time to secure these people in order to form business models for an eventual restarting of this economy. It's of course difficult, because Kharkiv will be a heavily fortified border town, because it directly borders Russia, of course. But I mean, the potential even before the war was enormous. And your direct competitors in terms of IT coding, well, it would be Russians and Belarusians. And you can imagine what happens to these people. They could be happy they are alive or fled to Turkey or whatever. But I think it will be very difficult for both Russian and Belarusian IT industry to reorganize themselves after the war. So this is something that Ukraine will certainly benefit from. And well, another idea is, of course, energy. And now, speaking of the war again, you may get an idea. This is the dam at Novokakhovka. You may get an idea of why Russia systematically destroys infrastructure, energy infrastructure in particular. And you don't even have to use explosives. You can just elevate the water level to a point that the dam is just technically failing. So the water pressure is simply too high, the dam breaks, and that would be it. Now, speaking of this, Novokakhovka is, I would say, a Soviet prestige project built in the 1950s with a clear propaganda goal in mind, to build what they call the Soviet man, or the Soviet being. Well, of course, Ukraine being a sovereign nation in 18, being forcibly integrated into the Soviet empire. Well, let's not talk about this. We now create the Soviet man. And we do that by building these very large infrastructures. And you can see the idea. If you're now beset with this Russian imperial idea that I talked about, then it's very simple from your point of view. This is a Soviet construction. The empire built it. The empire can destroy it. Right? So if you really want to understand it, you have to look at it from this imperial perspective in order to get an idea of what's happening. So if the empire cannot get it, then no one gets it. And this is why it's destroyed. Of course, this is a war crime. Of course, this will be prosecuted, but it doesn't help you in the short term, but it helps you in the long term for two reasons. I just said that this was built in the 1950s. So from an economic point of view, of course, the devastation is terrible, yes. But it also means that this infrastructure was basically written off. So what is not disappeared is the river itself and the very large potential for water power it offers. And this only applies to the Dnieper or Dnipro. I have to say sorry because I learned all these names in Russian. So sometimes I say the Russian name, not the Ukrainian. So please forgive me if I do that. But I mean, the Dnipro is about 2 miles wide at this point. And it's not the only point. So in the upper left corner, you see the water and the nuclear power plants that are currently operating in Ukraine. And I would also like to draw your attention not only to the Dnipro River, but also to the southern Bug River, which most of you probably have never heard about unless you are Ukrainian or you have traveled there before. But it's wider than the Rhine, 800 kilometers long, and with enormous potential for water power. So you see, it is just at a time where we in Europe are struggling with our electricity nets, where we are moving into a green energy production, and where we're saying, okay, we are no longer burning fossil fuels. We're going to electrify everything. We're going to electrify heating, electrify cooling, electrify transport and mobility. And that, of course, means that our demand for electricity will grow, and we will need some area of where that can be produced. And well, it sounds cynical, but one of the prime areas where it can be produced is Ukraine, and particularly because many large plants that existed in Ukraine and consumed a lot of energy, think Mariupol, for example, Azovstal and Azov-Elektro, are no longer there because they were destroyed in the war. So this is what this chart on the upper right tells you. The potential of Ukraine for energy export or energy production at this time is much larger than energy demand. So it gives you a huge surplus that could be exported to Western Europe. And that not only applies to water and nuclear power, it also applies to renewable energy. If you consider the enormous stretches of land that you have available. So these are not our small little states in Central Europe where there is, I would say, mediocre sun, if at all. This is, well, a very, very large territorial state, almost 1.5 times as large as France. And it's also much hotter. So it gives you, and much windier, of course, especially in Crimea and along the coast. So it gives you lots of potential for solar and for wind energy. The thing is just to, as in the case of the railway lines, the thing is just to, well, transport the goddamn electricity to us, to Western Europe. And it was one of the masterpieces of Swiss electrical engineering that Ukraine is now synchronous with ENTSO-E. You see this blue area, this is our European maximum voltage grid, the ENTSO-E. And Ukraine is part of that. It's synchronous with the grid since March 15, 22. It was hooked onto the grid basically overnight by, well, it was a coup of Swiss and Ukrainian engineers. Very, very impressive. It's never done before in history. But this is, I would say, a short-term improvisation. But what we really need to do is build electrical engineering, build electrical connections that integrate Ukrainian electricity production into the European synchronous grid. And that means we need infrastructure to do that, because the grid being synchronous is not enough. We also need capacity. And I've brought you a little snippet from this ENTSO-E map. And what you see here in green and yellow, this is the European Western European structure of ENTSO-E. So these would be 220 and 380 kilovolt connections. And in blue and yellow, you see the old Soviet electricity net. So this would be 300 and blue would be 750 kilovolts. And you see that there are very few connections between these networks. And this is one of the very few at Mukachevo, where you have a connection into Velike Kapushani, and so in the neighboring Slovakia area. But what you really need to expand is, of course, the link into Poland. So in this area, because it's here where we will have a lot of industrial and military infrastructure. What you see on the top left, this is a high voltage direct cable. This is what the Germans have been trying to build since 10 years, so-called Stromautobahn. Probably have heard the German word, that would connect the northern German wind farms to the southern German industrial zones. They still haven't managed to build it. But I think Ukraine would be a much better place to put these electricity motorways. And talking about that corridor, I don't know if you ever heard about Rzeszów in Poland before the war. If you nod now, then you must be Ukrainian, because I have not met any Western European who knew about Rzeszów before the war. It used to be a very, I would say, a rundown regional airport that was served by Ryanair twice a week. So you really have to know it's there, because otherwise, no chance. Now, Rzeszów is now the central hub protected by the United States Army and Patriot batteries and logistics and whatnot, the central hub that brings Western weapons into Ukraine. And I have said this in an interview in Poland about 2 months ago, that Rzeszów is basically the new Ramstein. This is the core of an air base and a logistics base that is going to be built in this area. And even today, if you're a plane spotter, then you can see the very large machines you see very, very rarely in Europe, like C-17 transporter, that go to this little place. It's a marvel they can actually land there. Pilots probably have very good life insurance. And yeah, but it gives you an idea. If you're now a farmer in Poland, anywhere between Lublin and Krakow, then you have just been made a millionaire by the war, because this land will become very, very valuable, because basically anything you build to integrate Ukraine by Western links into Western infrastructure, Western railways, Western electricity, Western military support, all of this will be built in this corridor. So between Lviv, Przemysl, and Rzeszów. And this is the area that you should consider, particularly if you're into railways, because Lviv is one of the very few areas where we have the European standard gauge, so the normal track we use in Europe, like 1435 millimeters, and the old Russian broad gauge, which is still used in Ukraine, 1520 millimeters. And we don't have so many places where you have these two at the same time. But the Lviv area would be one of them. So this would be like a natural place, of course, to build terminals and to build logistics infrastructures. And something you should also consider in terms of the law of commerce, we have a very favorable triangle that opens up for commerce that is free of any customs, free of any complicated tax or export agreements. We have free trade between Ukraine and Switzerland. Since the Brexit, we have free trade between Switzerland and the UK, and the Ukraine also has free trade with the UK. So you see, you have a natural triangle that is formed here. And Switzerland is the only country in continental Europe that has free trade with China. So you can see where this is going, right? And this gives you very, very favorable opportunities. You see, our foreign minister, Mr. Cassis, has absolutely no problem of advocating this. And in economic terms, it makes very much sense also for Switzerland to do this. So, of course, this is a perspective. Everything I say is a perspective for after the war, but it's a perspective for a country that has prevailed and that will prevail in this war, even if the sacrifice is terrible. But I think this will define Ukraine for, I would say, certainly the rest of this century, if not for many centuries to come. And this was probably the final war of sovereignty and independence that Ukraine is now fighting. Yes, the as I said, is that there is no easy way to put it. That the sacrifice is terrible, and it will demand, well, lots of courage, and the people of Ukraine will have to tolerate lots of destruction. But the important thing is that all technical systems, all infrastructure, all of that can be rebuilt. Human loss cannot be rebuilt. And I think that's why it's very important that Western support to Ukraine is being kept up and being strengthened so that this war can be ended and civil reconstruction can begin. I would be happy to see this earlier than later. And I hope that the West has now learned during the course of this war that there is simply no alternative. And that brings me back to my first slides. The alternative is the empire. It's a gradual expansion of Russian imperial policy into every nation that is not part of NATO. So if you ask yourself what would have happened if Ukraine had not stood up, well, Ukraine would no longer exist as a sovereign state, and next would be Moldova. And then what? And comes the destabilization of Slovakia and Poland, and you can see where this game is going. So we can be very lucky that Ukraine is waging this war for the West. It's probably the last front and the last chance we had to prevent another expansion of this empire. And I think the future we are now looking to in the West is very favorable. And I think the very least that Western industry or Western business can do is, well, if not for respect of the law, or if not for respect of human life, then for God's sake, for respect of business. But please do it, because there is no alternative, right? The alternative is the empire. And this is really something you should consider yourself. I'm speaking in similar terms before industry, before associations, before banks, and I tell them all the same. You don't have to be pro-Ukrainian. You don't even have to know about anything about Ukraine. But you have to know about the alternative. It's either this, a Western integration of Ukraine, or it's the empire. So choose wisely, right? And this is what I expressly would like to convey to everyone who's listening in and now considering, oh, should I do business with Russia? Should we go back to the world before the war? And I always keep saying the same thing. There will be no back. There will be no going back to the world before the war. And you can choose between Ukraine, which will be a pro-Western, pro-NATO, pro-business environment, or you can choose the empire. That's the choice you have. And I think it's pretty clear what I would advocate to do. This is also the end of my little presentation. So it's not really much that I can offer. It's just some ideas. But I hope you get an idea of what the historic choice is we now have. And it's in fact, it's our generation that will have to build it. For the next generation that is probably going to live in peace. But we will be the next generation of war. And I tell you truly that when the war broke out, I'm 45 now, and when I was in West Berlin and saw the inner German border, I was a boy, and I thought, okay, this is frightening, right? You see the Soviets, you see their little marionettes in the East German puppet state, and you think, okay, this is somewhat unreal. And then comes 1990 and the wall falls and you have German reunification and you think, okay, all this is like a bad dream, all this is over. 33 years later, oopsie, it begins again. And this is the world we will have to live in for the rest of our lives, for our generations who have still experienced this. And I hope that for the next generation that is to come, this will be just a story in the history books. So as terrible as it is for us, we also have to see the war in these perspectives. This is not something we do for tomorrow, it's something we do for the rest of the century. And with that, I would conclude my little ideas, just to give you an idea of how will this reconstruction look like? When we say it's for the next generation, then I would say we will have two Ukraines. One is the Ukraine that is mostly not destroyed or not significantly destroyed. That would apply, for example, to cities like Odessa. It would also apply to Kiev, to basically all the larger cities. Of course, they are targeted by Russian artillery and by Russian missiles, but that damage is not so significant that you would say everything is destroyed, people have no future, people live in basements and they have no running waters. No, absolutely not. I've talked to war reporters who are traveling in Odessa, for example, and they thought, well, life in Odessa is somewhat surreal. People sit in cafes, people get their nails manicured, people drive around in cars, people run around in shorts by the seashore. And still, of course, you have the air alarms and you expect a missile to come down, but still, it's not like, and you see this is a common misperception in the West. Like we are so bombarded in the West with all of these pictures from Bakhmut and so, oh, Bakhmut, everything is destroyed. Yes, of course, it's destroyed. But this would apply to this zone. So the zone where you have the great majority of actual combat, of land combat, of course, these cities are significantly destroyed, if not completely destroyed. And probably many of them will not be rebuilt, particularly because some of them are Soviet heritage. So they were basically Soviet industrial cities that were built when there was still coal and steel industry in the Donbass. But of course, the major question is, will people who have fled from these areas ever return? If they will return, then of course we will need humanitarian aid, then we will need civil reconstruction, and these cities will be rebuilt. And there are historic precedents for that. Think Minsk, for example, the capital of Belarus, was completely destroyed in World War II and completely rebuilt. Think Warsaw, completely destroyed. The Germans completely destroyed it, bombarded it to basically raze it to the ground. Warsaw was rebuilt. So it's not like because these cities are destroyed now that they cannot be rebuilt, but it will probably a discussion of, well, is this a genuine historic settlement? So is this something like where you have actually Ukrainians live there because they want to live there? Or is this an ex-Soviet industrial settlement that is probably not worth or not attractive to rebuild? But I think it's the red sector where we will have to see most of humanitarian aid, most of infrastructure reconstruction, most of reconstruction of cities. So this would be the area where you have all the development agencies, Red Cross, all the construction work going on. And while this is being rebuilt, you can still do business with the blue sector, with a Ukraine that has suffered damage, yes, but that is not significantly destroyed to a point where you would say you can no longer do business or no longer travel or no longer do anything. And so whenever you watch documentaries or footage from the war and you see these people, these pictures from the combat zone, then what you actually see is this snippet from the red sector where most of the combat is happening now, but you don't see all of Ukraine. And that is the problem, because these pictures from the media, they shape your mind into believing the country is completely destroyed and it's not worth anything. And that is simply not true. So it's more like with this in mind that you should think about the war when you keep watching it, especially if you keep following it every day. So that's the end of what I have to say. Thanks very much for your attention and your presence here. And I'm open to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.